We have looked at why stories work and also how stories work. So in this next section, let's turn our attention to what is a story and give you some tips and tools that you can incorporate immediately into your storytelling. I should also mention that our focus will be mainly on oral non-fiction storytelling, since this is the most common communication form, although several of the points we cover will also cross over into the written form, but not all. What is a story? My favourite definition of story came from a gentleman called Peter Guber. He's a producer out in LA and produced such movies as Colour Purple, Batman, Kids Are All Right, Midnight Express, Gorillas in the Mist, and many, many more. He also owns a bunch of baseball teams and a basketball team, and he also wrote a book called Tell to Win. In his book, he stated that all his successes have been when he told the story, and all his failures have been when he got too wrapped up in the numbers and the profits. In his book, he said, "A story is a vehicle that allows you to put the facts in an emotional context." I've always loved this definition for a few reasons. First, I like its simplicity. Think of stories as little pockets of information. They can be short, concise, purposeful, and often can be told in the same amount of time it would take to list facts or figures. Don't think of stories as long-winded, drawn-out tales that take a long time to tell. Second, it's all about the facts. Facts are important. For years, people have thought stories are fluff. They are not. It's just a different, more successful way of delivering the facts. And third, it tells you what to do. All we have to do is take our facts and wrap them in an emotional context so the audience can recall them. That's it. Fine, but how do we do this? All we need to remember is the 3 R's. Recollection plus reflection equals recall. So what does this actually mean? A story only needs 2 things. First, the recollection. Think of recollection as the bare bones of the story, the events that occurred, the anecdote. It's what you remembered happened, the facts. Most stories you'll hear will have just the recollection. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. For instance, when I was 9 years old, I was riding my bike, I fell off, I broke my leg, I spent the night in the hospital. But to make a story soar to the next level, you need to add a critical second element, which is reflection. Think of the reflection as the flesh, blood, and heart of the story. It's the reflections that will create the emotional context that Peter Guber spoke about. Examples of possible moments of reflection that could be added are: how did it make you feel or think? This singly is the most commonly missed element in most of the stories that I hear. When I was 9 and crashed my bike, how did it feel as I lost control? Or how did it feel when my leg snapped? What did I think of the next time I rode a bike? Other moments of reflections could be why you did something, thoughts that are triggered by the anecdote, a moral or lesson learned, extra details describing a person or a location, dialogue, metaphor or analogy, a fictional moment, or a dream that arises out of the action. Great. We have these 2 elements, the recollection and the reflection. But how do we put them together? Well, here's the thing. However you want to. But since it's the reflection that's the part that's usually missing, I would suggest for those of you who are more analytically inclined or maybe find comfort in structure, think of running with the recollections and then every now and then be sure to add a moment of reflection. So it might look like recollection, 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 reflection, recollection, recollection, and so on. And for those of you who are a touch more freewheeling, it's however you want to tell the story. There's no right or wrong. So yours might look like recollection, reflection, reflection, recollection, recollection, reflection, reflection, reflection. We will look at some of the different types of reflections in greater detail in just a moment. But first, let's chat for a moment about structure. As I mentioned earlier, our focus for this module is on oral non-fiction stories. So basically, we're dealing with real life and real stories. For this reason, I really don't spend a lot of time talking about structure because a real personal narrative has its structure naturally embedded. I was 9 years old, I rode my bike, I crashed, broke my leg, I spent the night in the hospital. Take Freytag's pyramid as a structure example, and you can see that the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution are all there. After all, stories existed way before somebody decided to start talking about structure. Now, of course, if we were talking about creating fictional stories, it would be essential to understand and conform to some type of story structure. Oh, by the way, Gustav Freytag was this German dude who lived around the mid-1800s. He was a playwright and a novelist, and he recognized and identified common patterns in the plots of stories, novels, and plays, and came up with this nifty pyramid, which I have to confess I rather like. Let's look a little closer at what makes up a moment of reflection, and also along the way give you a few tips and tools that you can incorporate into your storytelling. I first heard about this concept of combining the recollection, that's the anecdote, with moments of reflection from Ira Glass, who is a bloody brilliant storyteller and the longtime host and creator of the NPR radio show This American Life. I mentioned earlier that how did it make you feel is the most commonly missing element, and yet possibly the most important to include. I think the reason it's so often missing is simply because it's really difficult to describe feelings. Saying I was sad or I was happy or I was afraid just doesn't cut it. So here's a tip. When you want to describe how you felt and you are grappling with the actual emotion that caused the feeling you experienced at a pivotal point in your story, think about another time in your life that you experienced the same feeling or emotion. Then all you have to do is leap out of your story and share that moment of reflection. The further removed the reflection is from the story, the better. Remember, you are just creating yet more opportunity for your audience to connect with you. Then just tie it back into your story and carry on. If I wanted to let you know how I felt when I started to lose control of my bike when I was 9, I might say, as the hill got steeper, the bike accelerated and started to go faster and faster and faster. I went bungee jumping once, and I remember standing on the side of the Royal Gorge Bridge with my toes over the edge, looking down at the Arkansas River 150 feet below. I leant slowly forward, and then I passed the point of no control, and I started to fall. I was instantly filled with terror, and I stopped breathing, my heart stopped, and it was as if my life was about to end. And yet, there was this wild exhilaration, this rush, this risk. I am living life. This is how I felt as a 9-year-old, careening down the hill on the bike. The world a blur, living on the edge. Nothing can stop me. I'm invincible. And then I hit the tree. Or even simpler, I bungee jumped once. The loss of control terrified me, but it was also one of the most freeing and exhilarating moments of my life. This is how I now felt on my bike. Then I hit the tree. Both will work fine. You just have to make sure that you let your audience know how you feel. You probably notice some differences between the two versions, so let's explore for a moment. In the first version, I included a description of the place I bungee jumped. Nothing fancy, all kind of long-winded. I stood on the side of the Royal Gorge Bridge, toes over the edge, looked down to the Arkansas River that was 150 feet below. So why would I choose to include this? Well, this is one of my favorite storytelling tips of all time. And when I train lawyers and share this with them, they literally salivate. The brain doesn't distinguish between a lived image and an imagined image. Think about that for a moment. Brain makes no distinction. So if I give you a few basic details about a location, for instance, the side of a bridge, high above a river, and I'm about to bungee jump off, your brain goes to work filling in all the rest of the details, pulling from your long-term memory, and does such a great job that you can now experience that location as if you've actually been there yourself. It's likely even now that you may have built some kind of image of the Royal Gorge Bridge in your own mind, even if you've never ever seen it. The wonderful thing is, this works just as well when describing people as it does for locations. You can probably understand why lawyers get so excited when thinking about describing critical scenes or individuals involved in a case to the jury, and knowing that each jury member is busily building their own images in their heads that they can connect to and recall. If you think this sounds a little bit far-fetched, ask yourself, have I ever read a book and then gone and seen the movie? How was it? Usually a little disappointing, because when you read the book, you build your own mental model of what the characters and the locations looked like, and you own those images. When you see the movie, you are now being forced to look at the director's vision, his images, and it might still be really good, but it's different. It's not yours. Remember, we humans love to work and puzzle things out. We just don't like to know that we're working. Including descriptions of places or people will encourage your audience to go to work and build the rest of the images themselves, the whole while generating a stronger connection. Here's another tip to remember. You will notice that I use names in the first version. Names are hugely important to include in your stories, especially the names of people. It's the easiest way to add emotion. I often hear people tell me about stories about their spouse or daughter or son or grandma or their greatest friend of all time and never once tell me their name. This might be because they know the person so well, they assume I know them too. But until I hear the name, they are just a spouse, a son, a daughter, a friend, something that's generic and unmemorable. Simply add a name and maybe a brief description if appropriate, and everything changes. They become a real person who I can connect through my experiences with my spouse, Susan, or my son, Alistair, or my daughter, Maitland. This is another fun thing to check out the next time you're in a conversation with someone. See if they use names. It's kind of weird how we don't, but it's easy to start including them, and they make a huge difference. Along with names, details and specifics always help the audience. If we go back to me as a 9-year-old careening down a hill on my bike, the picture in your mind will be different if earlier in the story I told you that for my 9th birthday I'd received a beautiful orange Swin Stingray with a white banana seat and high-rise chrome handlebars. It changes still further if I add at the end of the sentence, nothing in the world was more important to me than this bike. Now, how does the scene change if I let you know that it's a sticky, humid summer day without a breath of wind? Or watch it change again if it's an icy cold grey winter morning? When I crash into the tree, what does the tree look like to you? Is it different depending on the weather? How fun to be able to help build images in your audience's head. But this does lead us to an important question. If we have wants and we're using our storytelling skills to help us be better leaders, how does this play into the equation? Well, as you can see, we have a certain amount of control as to how we shape and craft your story to affect your audience. But this is of no value if you are not purposeful in knowing what it is that you want. What's your purpose? Once you identify this, you know what your story is about, and it's much easier to craft. But before you start thinking about your story, it's critical to think about who is your audience.